There are a lot of questions that we frequently get asked, and the biggest one that we want to answer today is how can I legally live in a tiny home in Canada? Can you legally live in a tiny home in Canada? It's a really good question, and I'm going to try really hard to answer that to the best of my ability. North America sees tiny homes all over the place. You see a lot of HGTV shows about it, see a lot of Netflix stuff about it, see a lot of YouTube stuff about it, but it's still hard to maneuver through the red tape of whether it's actually possible. So in Canada specifically, out west we have a lot of tiny homes. We've actually got a lot more in Quebec, you just don't hear about it that much, and then a little bit out east. And Ontario seems to be very behind. That's where we're located, and we're trying to catch up, but there's still a lot of red tape to go through. Now, even within one province itself, there's a lot of differences from municipality to municipality to municipality, and all of them look at different rules and different regulations, even though they fall under the official plan of that province that they're sitting in. So the biggest thing that this comes from is, what is a tiny home? There is no legal definition of what a tiny home is. And when we don't have a legal definition within a zoning bylaw, we go to the Webster Dictionary. Guess what? There's no legal definition there either. So what do we do? So when there's no legal definition for something, it's very hard to fit it into any sort of bylaw. Some things that could be deemed tiny homes that do fit in these bylaws are things like a laneway house, or a garden suite, or a bunkie, or an accessory dwelling unit, or, my term, a prefabricated attached apartment. These are all things that currently fit inside of existing zoning bylaws. Now, if you really delve into it, all of these things are secondary uses on a property. They're not primary uses. So what that means is we have a property, it's zoned as something, it has a primary use, so that could be a farmhouse, that could be a single family home, that could be a duplex, it could be an apartment building. But the secondary use is putting that other structure on the property that we work into the bylaw by some means, but to us, we all call it a tiny home. There are not a lot of places where we can actually put a tiny home as a primary use within Ontario. Now, we can do a lot of that elsewhere, and we'll get into a lot of that in the future, but in Ontario specifically, primary uses are only allowed in municipalities that might not have a minimum house size. So Norfolk County is one of those that does not have a minimum house size. Tay Valley Township is another one that does not have a minimum house size. So we can take a tiny house and put it on that property. Now again, what do we determine is tiny? The general realization of a tiny house is anything less than 500 square feet. Some people will say 400 square feet, but generally less than 500. In Hamilton bylaws, for instance, a laneway house is anything that's less than 550 square feet, 50 square meters, because we're Canadian and we use metric. So other places that we can use a tiny home as a primary residence or a primary use on the property could include things like an unorganized township land. There is no municipal government there, so I don't want to say that anything's allowed, but technically anything's allowed. Other places are maybe cottage country. Certain places like that will allow the cottage because it's not a full-time living scenario, it's just a cottage. Perhaps a bunkie on your cottage property. If we go to Nova Scotia, there's a new building code there that allows us to not have a building permit for anything less than 400 square feet. So now all of a sudden we can build anything we want, less than 400 square feet, and not have to abide by the provincial building code. When we bring that back to Ontario, some of the things in the provincial building code limit our use of tiny home terminology because we need minimum ceiling heights. And so lofts don't count as livable space. We need minimum room sizes, so all of a sudden we need a certain amount of space to actually be deemed as a house and actually be deemed livable. So we need to go to those unorganized townships to do what we see on HGTV and on Netflix and YouTube everywhere as to what most people think of as tiny homes. When we're talking about legalities of tiny homes throughout Canada, there's often a few points that we have to bring up to potential clients about what might be legal in their area. And we're going to want to get into just a couple of those right now. One of those is wheels. So this is the Millennial. This is the first unit that I ever built, and it served us really well for the last 18 months as an Airbnb unit, something you might want to consider yourself. This one was built on wheels because that's how people know tiny homes. So we wanted to introduce ourselves to the market in the way that everyone else is mostly building tiny homes. This, however, is not a legal house in Ontario because there's a law that says you can't live in something with wheels. It can easily be your cottage, but it can't be your house. It can't be your primary residence. You live in one of these and you travel around from place to place, you need to register your license per se at your parents' house or your brother's house or your sister's house or something like that. When we go over to this one over here, right beside us, this one is actually sitting on a trailer. You can see that it's only strapped down. Right here is where we have the strapping point. This is where we put jacks on when we get to the site. Jack the house up, roll the trailer out, jack the house back down onto a permanent foundation. It's only as permanent as until you roll the trailer back under it and leave, and it's still mobile. But this now deems to be a legal house in Ontario. There's a lot of places throughout North America that have realized the issues with building on wheels and bypassing the building permit stage. And so a lot of those places are actually now getting to the point of requiring them to not be on wheels and requiring building permits. So this is something that you might be seeing a lot more of in the future. Follow me to the rooftop patio. Another comment we get often by our potential clients is, can this go off-grid? Well, the simple answer is, certainly it can go off-grid. And what does that actually mean? It entails a lot of extra costs, money, time, and we might not be able to make it legal because a lot of municipalities actually require you to be hooked up to the grid. So if you're going to put all the extra money into making something off-grid and then have to connect anyways, why bother? The other thing people often say is, yeah, I really want to put solar panels on the roof. And I say, well, where are you going to park it? Oh, I want to tuck it into a little bit of a forest. Well, now you can't get any sun through the trees onto the solar panels to charge the batteries. So now you spent a bunch of money on something that's never going to work. So a lot of this has to be thought out a bit further. Off-grid is a great option if you're looking at moving to a bunch of places that may not have the right hookup for you, or if you're going to park it in something that has a bunch of sunlight potential for the middle of the day and then maybe not so much later. So where's this movement going, and what does that mean legally? Let's look at this in reference to the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area. The average housing cost is $825,000, and that covers everything from single-family homes to condo units. That's the average, and it just gets worse all the time. This is happening everywhere, by the way. So, the average tiny house is only $100,000, way more cost-effective. And as this gets to be harder and harder to get into the housing market, more and more people are going to be turning to tiny houses. And the more people that turn to tiny houses, the more the government is going to have to change bylaws and change rules and change laws provincially and federally and municipally into allowing us to put these in more places, to allow more people to live in small spaces, to allow lofts to happen and ladders that might not quite meet the current building codes. So legal things are going to change, and I'm looking forward to it, and so should you. What can you do right now to put a tiny house legally somewhere? We are filming in Hamilton, so let's talk about Hamilton specifically. And in a link below, you're going to be able to download an example checklist on what to look for in Hamilton for land where you could legally put a tiny house. Right now, the only way we can legally put it in Hamilton is as a laneway house within the downtown core. So check that checklist out. And this gets very client driven. So we do workshops every month to talk about how to fit this into a piece of land in the municipality that you want to live in. So if you come to one of our workshops, we'll prepare a checklist just like this one, specific to your municipality. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm glad you were here and we could learn a little bit more about living legally in a tiny house in Canada. Come back next Friday and I'll teach you even more. But to do that, you need to subscribe. Remember, I'm Daniel Ott. This is UpSizeDown, where we turn housing on its head.